Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
We're going to fly 35,000 men and drop them behind enemy lines. Frankly, this sort of thing has never been attempted before. And that, listeners, is an American doing a really bad posh impersonation of Dirk Bogarde portraying General Frederick Browning. Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm your co-host, Kevin Getz, the resident Yank, and my great mate and number one pilot, Andy Bryant. Andy, how you doing?
Well, I'm reeling from that excellent Nick Van. I mean, General Browning impression.
Well, if you're going to do it in style. So if you haven't guessed, dear listeners, we're going to sit in our pub and we're going to discuss General Boy Browning. And we need to, I don't want to say bust the myth, but at least provide a little correction of how everyone perceives Browning via the movie. You can't get around it. It's the elephant in the room. And this will be the first of several series of airborne personalities. We sit there and talk about the battles, but who are the men behind the leadership roles? So,
yeah, I know you've been chomping at the bit to get this episode recorded.
Yeah, but obviously before we chat, I was waiting for you to come in, and I already got my pint. I'm having a Belgian blonde. What are you having, Andy? Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Let me shake the magic 8-ball. Magic 8-ball. What is Andy having? Oh, it says, you idiot, he's drinking Guinness.
I hate to say it, but yeah, your 8-ball is very right. And I am partaking in a nice pint of Guinness.
As is our custom, raise a glass. Cheers. We're going to discuss Boy, and I picked up Richard Mead's book, General Boy, The Life of Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Browning. I encourage all of our listeners to either find a hard copy, Kindle, whatever you use to access books. Definitely get this. Yeah. I felt it was a very good read. Obviously, going in, one has to keep in mind he might be a Browning advocate. But again, I think it certainly provides insight and information as to the shape of who Browning was. One of the things I found out really interesting, and this says a lot about Browning, he did not want any type of biography done of him as long as he was alive.
No.
And that he encouraged anyone who had served under him that if there were any biographies or people asking, he said, please don't cooperate with those folks. And I think that's really interesting. And by all accounts, I mean, he has been dubbed the father of British Airborne. And here's a guy who's making a very conscious decision to go, I don't want a biography. I don't want anything done. If anybody asks about me, don't cooperate.
Yeah.
I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, you can read that two ways, can't you? You can read it. Was he just modest about his wartime experiences? Or did he feel that he could be heavily criticized? You know, just being devil's advocate. And I think I'm going to be devil's advocate an awful lot in this episode.
Absolutely.
I'm certainly not expecting to draw any definite conclusions. I think it really does come down to what the individual actually thinks at the end of the day. And it would be really interesting to hear what listeners have got to say. So please remember to put something in the comments section of wherever you listen, because we really do like to see your feedback. And anyway, let's talk about Boy. Where's he coming from? What's his story?
So he's born in 1896. His family, and I had no idea, I had always had heard of him as Boy. But after reading this, I find out that his family and close friends called him Tommy. Growing up, he becomes increasingly assertive, disruptive. And so his father decides to send him to boarding school 3 months before his 9th birthday. Now, for our listeners here in the States, can you give us a little bit of insight into that?
It was very much the done thing back in those days. It was considered a bit of a class thing, because obviously it takes money to send a child to boarding school, but it is considered to be a very good education. The clue is in the name. You board there, you stay there, and then you'll come home, maybe at weekends, but generally you'll come home at the end of the term for holidays, etc., etc.
Yeah. And that's really interesting that you described it as it's an opportunity for a higher education, because as it turns out, Frederick's not known for his academics. He is, though, rather good at sport, and he is quite good at cricket, football, which is soccer here in the United States, diving, and this is really fascinating. So in May 1924, he is selected provisionally to represent Great Britain in the 100-meter and 400-meter hurdles of the Paris Olympic Games. Now, why is that so significant? Well, those of you of film fandom will know that is the famous Chariots of Fire Paris Olympics. Harold Abrams and Eric Liddell. He doesn't actually go to France, but he does become a Winter Olympian in the bobsled and competed in the 1928 Winter Games.
And that's interesting because being an athlete, being a sportsman, it does mean that they've got a competitive streak.
Yes.
Which I think does set him up for how he conducts himself in his military career, which you mentioned obviously the Olympics, but by this time he's actually already in the army, isn't he?
Yes, he is. He joins Officer Training Corps at age 15 after he gains entrance to Eton. He continues his traditional sport while he's there. He's into rowing and continues track and field with the hurdles. He joins the Officer Training Corps again at 15. And this was really interesting, too. This is going to say a lot about who he is. He's elected to the Somerville Debate Society in 1913. And this is fascinating. His first debate is over the advantages and disadvantages of a channel tunnel. Think about that. 1913, they're thinking about a tunnel to get from the UK to mainland Europe.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think it had been thought of even earlier than that because I think they were worried about Napoleon digging a tunnel at one point.
Yeah. So in December 1914, he enters Sandhurst, and in 1915, he becomes gazetted second lieutenant in the Grenadier Guards. And so it is here in 1915 that he earns the nickname that everybody knows him as, and that's Boy.
Yep.
It's going to follow him his entire career. However, the family is still going to call him Tommy.
Yep.
And I know you had mentioned before, but what does it mean to be a Grenadier Guard?
Well, I think I said this on the Rock and Chatterton episode, that the guards, the Brigadier Guards, are considered they certainly consider themselves the top tier of the British Army. It goes way back. It goes back to the Battle of Waterloo. That's where they actually pick up the famous bearskins off Napoleon's old guard. They certainly consider themselves a cut above the rest. And because of their ceremonial duties, there is an onus on spit and polish, turnout, drill, as we used to call it in the army, the bullshit. They are also considered to be very good soldiers as well, very disciplined soldiers.
Yes. So he's in the Grenadier Guards, and he's very young, so he's going to be extremely impressionable. So he's going to really formulate what his military life is going to look like when we fast forward to the 1940s. That foundation is being laid here.
Before we move on, because I think this will perhaps set up for how Boy is again in his army career. He actually doesn't get into Sandhurst. He actually fails the entrance criteria. He wasn't particularly good at maths and some other subjects, and he actually fails. Now, it's a combination of the fact that it's 1914, they've already started losing officers on what becomes the Western Front, but also as well, family connections and strings are pulled to actually get him into Sandhurst. And I think this is another factor that runs throughout Boy's career.
How much of a factor are his father's connections? Because his father was highly connected.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're huge. If he'd been anybody else, he might not have got into Sandhurst. So here's a little bit of the old Boy network on that one, I think. And again, I think this whole thing of connections and the old Boy network raises its head time and again, certainly throughout his tenure as commander of British Airborne.
And it's certainly going to play dividends for those who are in the British Airborne because of those connections. And we will get to that point and how important those connections were. So he ends up in the trenches. He develops a reputation for taking care of his men. He made sure that the rum ration, that there wasn't supposed to be any extra, because apparently if there's any extra, it was supposed to be returned. And he made sure that all of his men got the right amount of portions, so they basically drained it.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, because you have served, what does something like that, when an officer does that for you, what does that mean to you?
There has to be a certain amount of detachment you can't necessarily be one of the lads. But something like that would go a long way when you can actually see that your boss is looking out for you. It's a cliche, but it's true. Respect isn't given, it's earned.
Well, and then there were other things that he was doing. He would often have best billet competitions. Whoever won would be rewarded. And he specifically prevents one of his men from being court-martialed and subsequently being executed. So he steps in the middle of that and prevents that from happening. That speaks volumes to how he really cares about his men. It is here that he receives a DSO, and this is the citation. He took command of 3 companies whose officers had all become casualties, reorganized them, and proceeded to consolidate, exposing himself to very heavy machine gun or rifle fire. In 2 hours, he had placed the front line in a strong state of defense. So this is a man who's not afraid to jump into the fray. He received a mention in dispatches, and he also was a recipient of Croix de Guerre. So he becomes ADC to Sir Henry Rawlinson, and this is where he really cuts his teeth on his organizational skills. And by the end of the First World War, he's 22. Now he's going into the interwar period. And much like I'm sure everyone, he has a very difficult decision to make. Do I leave the military and do I go out into the private sector, or do I stay with it? And he ends up leaving to join his father at Twist and Browning, which is a wine trade business. He does find himself back into the military. And I find this, again, this is going to be a theme of a lot of the COs that he served under. The CO of the Horse Guards said this of Browning: "I regard him as the best adjutant in the Brigade of Guards." He's appointed as Grenadiers Resident Captain, which now allows him to play a role in shaping incoming guardsmen who are coming in from civilian life. So he has a hand in the installation of discipline, obedience of order, smartness of dress. And it is here where he develops his admiration and respect for the drill instructors, because those are the guys that are going to shape that. And we're going to see that later.
There's reoccurring themes all the way through his career. It starts with actually joining the Brigade of Guards, but we're jumping ahead of the story, but this is where he starts getting names like Bullshit Browning. Yeah. He's obviously a very good organizer, admin, and training. That's where his forte is. I mean, to be an adjutant, and as he goes on to be the adjutant of Sandhurst as well.
From 1924 to 28.
Yeah, you really.
Yep. And this is what Eric Girdwood, the commandant of Sandhurst, said of Browning at the time. He possesses powers of organization and administration above the average, and by his personal example and sense of discipline and duty, which he instilled into the staff. And GCs has produced a military machine of a very high standard. He's promoted to major, but again, and to give a sense of when you're an adjutant, you have a lot of things on your plate, don't you?
You're basically the executive officer of whoever's running the establishment, or if it's a regiment, then the colonel runs the regiment in theory, but the adjutant carries a lot of weight because he is doing the day-to-day general stuff.
And certainly he is diving into this position with lots of energy. Mm-hmm. And as a result, he's exhausted and he is granted leave. And because of that, he misses out on staff college. And Andy, why is staff college so important in the British military?
Well, staff college, back then you would do it before the age of 30. Otherwise you were considered you'd missed the boat. And without going to staff college, generally you can't actually then progress much higher than, say, a colonel. I'm not sure if you could be a brigadier, but you certainly couldn't progress. You're not generally going to be considered for a generalship if you don't go to staff college first and learn how to be on the general staff. So missing that is quite huge.
Yeah. And I'm glad you provided some context for that, because clearly he has that innate skill. Had he had the opportunity to attend staff college, it probably would have been polished further than what he already had. Coming across this up to this point, he definitely has the talent and the skill for it. Yeah. He ends up attending senior officer school in 1933. And this is what the school's commandant, Brigadier Tommy Lindsell, said: "A really good type of officer who will make a first-rate CO. He has sound ideas and is prepared to back them with sound arguments. A keen student of his profession. He shows marked capacity as a leader, and as an instructor, he has plenty of energy and drive. So we're getting the picture of, okay, we know where he is professionally. Things aren't doing so hot personally.
No, I mean, one of the other things that we didn't mention was that he was a keen sportsman, but he had a specific love of the water and being on the water, and that includes sailing.
Yeah.
And it's through sailing that he meets his wife.
Absolutely. He actually was engaged before.
Oh, yes.
He was engaged before he met Daphne, but that ends up getting called off. And then in October of 1929, his father dies from cirrhosis. And it's here that he ends up meeting Daphne. And I don't even know.
Daphne du Maurier.
Thank you, sir, for bailing me out on that one. And I think this is really interesting. So she initially declines, doesn't want to marry him, but then is told that if she doesn't marry him, it's going to wreck his career, and that she ends up proposing to him. That, to me, is fascinating.
She comes across as very much a mold breaker. She was ahead of her time in lots of respects. Very much a tomboy, from what I gather.
Yes.
But she was already then on her way to being a very successful writer when she met Boy.
Yes. And she is like, hey, I want nothing to do with that military wife stuff. No. Nothing. Don't want to hang out with the families. There is this dichotomy of, well, you need to marry him to help his career. And she's like, yeah, but I don't want to hang out with those folks. I don't want to be anywhere near them. But they end up getting married. He gets promoted in 1936 as a lieutenant colonel. He, in 1939, gets promoted to brigadier and commander of the Small Arms School. This allows him to use the school to promote minor infantry tactics and field craft to junior officers and NCOs. Again, he's organizing, he's administrating.
Mm-hmm.
He takes command of the 128 Brigade of the Hampshire Regiment.
So it's the 128 Brigade of the 43rd Wessex Division. The only reason I remember that is because that was my grandfather's division.
There you go. It's there that he is instilling. This is where the Guards' discipline starts to creep in. And Browning issued a standing order that any officer or any rank who falls out on the line of march will be court-martialed. But what's interesting, too, is so this is from Tom Balding, a liaison officer, and he says, it was our great good luck to have him. He looked us over and told us that we were of good quality, but not yet alert. He gave us 2 months to get it right. The bullshit is there, but there's a reason for it.
And also, as well, he was famous for having an explosive temper, but he was equally just as likely to ball someone out. And then when it's over and done with, go and have a sherry with them or a glass of port or whatever. So, yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Andy, because when you get chewed out, it's not personal. You take their lumps and then it's over with. And you're getting that sense with him, okay, you're going to get a bollocking. Correct it, and then you like that? I'm picking up the vernacular, my friend.
I'm sorry.
I'm picking it up.
Sorry. I love it when you talk tenor.
He's willing to. If you need the butt chewing, you're going to get it. But then it's over with. It's done, and it's not personal. So, and that's important too. I find it interesting here. He's considered for the promotion as Major General, Inspector of the Infantry, but there's no command and there's no real power with that. And he smartly says, I want no part of it. He stays away. He gets promoted to commander of the 24 Guards Brigade Group, which includes the Scots, Irish, and Welsh Guards. And again, for our American listening audience, who are the Scots, Irish, and Welsh Guards, Andy?
They're all part of the Brigade of Guards. Obviously, it is pretty much what it says on the tin, really. The Guards is made up of the Grenadier and Coldstream Guards, who are the English regiments, and then you've got the Welsh, Scots, and Irish Guards, which are drawn from, obviously, those parts of the UK. And the Irish Guards, obviously, that's not part of the UK, apart from Northern Ireland. And they would be drawn from those areas or people whose parents were maybe Irish or Scots, Welsh. So, that's basically where it comes from.
Yeah. Well, and it's here he develops a relationship with someone very significant and important, Alan Brooke. Allenbrook takes notice of Browning. The two develop a very strong working relationship. So Allenbrook's getting to know Browning. Browning's getting to know Allenbrook. But what's interesting is while this is all happening, again, we go back to his personal life. He's starting to have some difficulties. And this is where Daphne, he's gone all the time. He's busy. Even when he comes home, I don't want to say aloof, but he's so exhausted from doing what he was doing. He just is not connecting with her. And it's here that she begins to develop this emotional relationship with a gentleman by the name of Christopher Puxley. And he is the exact opposite of Browning. Because again, like I'd said, Browning, when he's coming home, he's exhausted. He just talks about work, vents about it. That's not what she wants. She wants the individual that she married, not this guy. And then so he gets back to work. This part I love. This is excellent. Exercise Bumper was a home forces exercise with about 250,000 men from 12 divisions and 3 independent brigades. And I love this because Browning uses commandeered buses to move his troops. And then he ordered a liaison officer to walk through the enemy lines with a judge's armband on to locate enemy positions and to come back.
I read that in Mead's book, and you know what instantly sprang to mind? The Dirty Dozen.
Yes.
Changing the red to the blue and blue to the red, whether it was armbands. And I just thought, wow, that's Lee Marvin there straight away.
Oh, yeah. So remember, we had mentioned this relationship with Allenbrook, and this is one of Allenbrook's diary entries in October of 1941, and he's there watching Browning. This is what he sees when he watches a demonstration of Browning's men attacking tanks. He goes, a first-class show, very well staged and full of useful lessons.
Yeah.
So this relationship with Allenbrook isn't just about a dinner. I mean, he is showing off his skills. And this is really, here's the ever important notation in the diary with regard to our listeners in our podcast, Ham and Jam. Also informed Browning that he had been selected for command of the Airborne Division and what I wanted him to do about it. Brooks thinks Browning is determined, energetic, personally ambitious. He's a natural leader, a good organizer, and the biggest thing, he's connected.
Yeah. And Allenbrook is the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He is the head of the British Army. He is the British equivalent of Marshal.
Yes.
So he's the top man. So if you've got him in your corner, you're not doing too bad.
November 3rd, 1941, Browning reports to Airborne GHQ to take command. And he brings a couple of names I'm going to mention here. They're going to be very familiar. Brian Urquhart and Richard DeVoe. And Richard DeVoe is of 156 Para fame, and he tragically will be killed in Arnhem in September of 44. So Browning's bringing with him this cadre of officers loyal to him, and that in turn, he was loyal to them. And this is really interesting, what Brian Urquhart noted. Once you got used to Browning's mannered arrogance, wearing his cap at meals in the mess and always slightly aloof and challenging, you found a delightful and imaginative man and a loyal friend. And that I found out when I was going through Richard's book is if you were loyal to Boy, he was loyal to you all the way to the end, And I thought that says a lot about his leadership. Sometimes that can get in the way, and then we will find out later. Yeah.
And in case people don't know, Brian Urquhart is the guy in A Bridge Too Far they changed his name. It was Major Crawler, but in real life, his name was Brian Urquhart. As I say, not to be confused with Roy Urquhart, who became the 1st Airborne Divisional Commander.
So he's in charge of this airborne thing. So what's the best way to mold all these volunteers?
Bullshit.
Yep. So he brings in these senior NCOs from the Brigade of Guards in the installation of discipline and this concept of establishing an esprit de corps. And he makes 2 very important decisions to help build that esprit de corps. And that is the choice of a beret color that is unlike anything else, and the choice of Bellerophon on the Pegasus to be worn on the battle dress jacket. He wants these airborne to be different, to have that strong sense of togetherness, belonging, esprit de corps. And so you're having to make decisions and you're having to change things as at some point because there's no blueprint.
There's the famous stories about, how the maroon beret came about and the maroon and the blue for Pegasus and everything. Was it the racing colours of his racehorse? Did Daphne du Maurier actually choose the maroon beret? There's another story where they were actually trying to choose the colour of the berets, and it's actually just a lowly NCO, last corporal or corporal, who's modelling different berets. They can't decide on the colour, so they asked this corporal, what do you think? And he says, well, I quite like the red one. So there's no definitive answer to those questions, but he was definitely involved in how they came about.
Again, this is just a great example of the energy, the drive that he has to get things done. British Airborne needs a vehicle to tow trailers, a 6-pounder. He gets granted a trial drive of the United States Army's Jeep, and he says, that's the vehicle we're going to use.
The fascinating thing about the Jeep story, is that they actually race one of these Jeeps down to see if it'll actually fit in the back of a hawser. And they find out it's like a half an inch too big.
Yeah.
So they actually contact the manufacturers in the States who are just about to go into some sort of production of these vehicles. And for the British Airborne versions, they actually make modifications so it will fit in the back of a hawser.
Yeah. And again, we had talked about him, what he thought of his men and how much he cared for them and what that type of leadership means. He's willing to do things that he wouldn't. Hey, so if you're going to jump, I'm going to jump. So he does 2 parachute jumps.
Yeah, and he also becomes a glider pilot.
Yes, he learns to fly the Horsa. He gets trained by George Chatterton. We've had our discussion on Chatterton. And again, this also speaks to Browning's personality. This is what Chatterton says. He goes, teaching a general of over 46 to fly was no easy matter, particularly this one, for he was a very determined person and highly inflammable. But what's fascinating is he goes solo within 8.5 hours. And then subsequently, he designs his own Army Air Corps wings and puts those on his uniform.
Yeah, there's no doubt the man had drive. But the whole discipline and bullshit thing, he was considered in some quarters a bit of a martinet, which, from my own experience, not many people like bullshit in the Army. Don't get me wrong, it does look smart when you're all dolled up and you're doing your drill spot on and everything, but it's the getting there that's the bit that nobody likes doing. So I'm going to read an example of something that happened, and this was to A Company, the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. And this was in 1942, and I'm reading from Mark Urban's Red Devils. This story has been recounted in other books. This is a bit of a lengthy one, but I'm going to read it anyway. So it was the late summer of 1942, an A Company of the 2nd Battalion was due to make a parachute drop. The men had been formed up, ready to board a dozen Whitleys at Netheravon Airfield. As so often in Army life, where the maximum hurry up and wait prevailed, the soldiers had been brought there, but for reasons not explained, there had been a delay. The men were standing about smoking and chatting as a general staff car cruised through the aerodrome, passing number 2 platoon. Moments later, there's a screech of brakes and an irate Major General Browning emerges from the vehicle. The general quickly fixes his gaze on Sergeant Eddie Hancock, a 21-year-old Londoner, who that morning was in charge of 2 platoon. Why, asked the general, had the platoon not been brought to attention in order to salute him? Sergeant Hancock recorded that he was subjected to a fierce verbal onslaught in which General Browning expressed his disgust at the indolence of my platoon. And Browning goes on to report the matter to the CO, and the sergeant finds himself tapping the boards in front of the 2nd Battalion's adjutant, the matter being so serious that the battalion might not embark on the overseas service that had all been expecting. And he goes on to say, among the paratroopers, the general was often referred to as bullshit Browning or bastard Browning.
Yeah, it's 2 sides to every coin. And obviously here we're in the infancy stages, 1942, and he has to use his connections because famously, Bomber Command doesn't want to give up aircraft. There's this notion that this airborne force shouldn't be used on a divisional level, but mainly for raids. And he says, no. He gets connected with Richard Windy Gale, and both of them are like, no, this needs to be a full division, divisional operations, not piecemeal stuff.
Again, this is where I'm going to be the devil's advocate, because my impression of Browning is that he was ambitious. He did have drive. As we mentioned it before about his athletics or tendencies. And as we know, in any sports, there's going to be competition. So he obviously had that competitive streak and he wanted to do well. I think also as well, this ties in with his wife as well, because when his father died, there was no money left. There was going to be no inheritance for him. So any money that he made, he had to make for himself. He's got a very successful wife who's pretty rich. And back in those days as well, for the wife to be wealthier and in some ways more powerful, if you like, than the husband, was not like today. It was different attitudes. So I think he's very driven. He's a driven individual anyway, but I think this is also driving him in the back of his mind as well. So being devil's advocate, how much of this, having this big old division and then eventually a core, how much is that is based on need or based on him trying to empire build? I know you're going to come on to that later on, but so where's it coming from? Because even Arthur Harris or Bomber Harris, when we've eventually got a division, 10,000 guys, he even says, well, did anyone not stop to think that we built this division? Well, we haven't got any planes to actually carry them. Did this not actually come into everyone's mind that at the moment their only offensive way of striking at Germany is through bomber command? You know, and now you're asking me to give up my plane.
Yes, and I will tell you this too. Certainly his drive, his high energy level, some people can perceive that as being he's just pushy. Now, there goes Boy Browning again, being pushy. Mm. And certainly when you have the relationship that you do with a Richard Gale and a Alan Brooke, human beings are human beings. There's going to be some jealousies and envies that, oh, Boy gets to go directly to the head. I got to go through this chain of command. What the heck?
Didn't Alan Brooke actually wrap his knuckles about basically going over his head?
Yeah, and I, in some sense, can see why he's wanting to do this because, again, this is an entirely new component of British military. This is new. This is not, again, there's no blueprint for this. There's no culture. There's no history. British Airborne doesn't trace itself back to the Crimean War and have that culture that's built into it. He's creating and building the culture and doing everything he can to keep it from being stamped out by other people who have their jealousies. And I'm glad you brought that up. So late summer of 1942, there's still this debate about what's it going to be. Is it going to be divisional? Is it going to be, are we going to do raids? What's going on? Harris is wanting to take bombers from him. Portal is kind of like, maybe we should reduce it. And it's here that Ismay is leaning towards those recommendations to shrink it. And Boy can go to Allenbrook and say, no, we're not going to do that. And it's interesting, Andy, how would the British Airborne have been shaped had you not had that relationship? The interesting one.
Oh, yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, the other thing as well is that Boy actually served with Churchill in the First World War for a time. So he even knows the Prime Minister.
Yeah, absolutely. And you and I know there's a very finite level of resources here. And when you're the Royal Air Force and when you're the Army and when you're the Navy, everybody's fighting for that pie. It's just what size piece are you going to get? Mm-hmm. And I don't know what the British Airborne looks like if Browning is not in that position. It's an interesting what if debate.
Yeah. How many what ifs are involved with the British Airborne?
We also see about this time, too, this is in July of 42. He goes to the States and he tours with Bill Lee, who formed the 101st Airborne. He is known as the father of the American Airborne, but ended up being invalided out of the Army. And it's here that, again, perceptions are a big thing. Browning has some very strong opinions of things, probably doesn't know how to read a room very well, expresses those opinions, and he ruffled some feathers.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately at that time of the war, a lot of British officers could fall foul of perceived arrogance because a little bit like the First World War, we had been fighting for a few years before the Americans came into it. And we hadn't exactly covered ourselves in glory, but we had learnt some lessons the hard way. And I think trying to get that advice across to the Americans who were newcomers to the Second World War at that time was coming across as arrogance. And I get that. I can see why the American comeback was, well, you haven't exactly done very well before we came along. It was unfortunate. And quite a few officers, Monty was famous for it, put his foot in his mouth all the time, but he didn't seem to care.
And then again, we talked about failing to read the room. He makes a trip to North Africa after Medjez El Bab battle, and he's there in front of the 2nd Battalion, all immaculately dressed. Those guys had just been through the ringer, and they're like, what the hell? And some of them just refuse to listen. You come in, Johnny come lately, all immaculately dressed out. We've been through the ringer, and what are you going to tell them?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't particularly impressed because old Boy Browning gives Montgomery a maroon beret as well with a parachute regiment badge. And when he famously turns up doing his twin badge thing with his 2 badges on his maroon beret, and a lot of the powers were like, well, you didn't bloody earn that.
Yeah, but then on the flip side of that, in late 42, early 43, he realizes even though he's this very strong advocate, he goes, they're not ready yet. And this is just something I thought about. I think two, he was, as much as he pushed for the British Airborne, he wasn't so overzealous that he couldn't sit back and go, we're not ready. So if someone who had been a little bit more zealous would have just continued to press forward, and certainly he's leading the charge for the British Airborne. But at the same time, in my opinion, his leadership skill set says, whoa, we're not ready. Let's hold off. We're quite there. We still need the support, still need the preparation. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I would generally agree with that. You could argue that General Hopkinson is a bit of a, for want of a better word, a zealot when he pushes for the glider landings in Ladbroke for that first airborne operation, which in hindsight probably was better suited to be in a parachute drop rather than a glider operation.
I just thought as I was reading that in Richard Meade's book that, okay, here's the leadership coming forward that says it is willing to acknowledge we're not ready.
I think that comes from as well, because training has been Browning's bread and butter, hasn't it?
Yes.
So he's going to be more than aware of the level of quality of the guys training wise that he's got under him. So that's coming from a position of training, small arms school and the Grenadier Guards Depot. And so, he's going to be all for that.
And he forwards his report to Allenbrook, and it's just like, listen, I know we're not ready, but if somebody gets in the way and stops our progress, it's going to be extremely detrimental to the British Airborne. And that's when Allenbrook tells Portal and Esme, let it happen. So again, he's building these connections. He invites several MPs to inspect the division. He gives them an opportunity to fly in a horse. He's the pilot. It's not the smoothest of landings, let's just say that. And one, he gets hurt. He boogers up his shoulder, but he did this without having knowledge.
Yeah, but the people in the back injured as well. That's the funny thing.
Yeah. So I can't imagine anybody but him getting away with this.
No.
So certainly having those kind of connections does pay off. So we get into 1943. We know what happens in the summer at Tuskegee. He becomes Major General of Airborne Forces, and he becomes an airborne advisor to Eisenhower through Allied Forces HQ. And this is, again, keep in mind, he's already ruffled some feathers with the Americans when he came to the States. Yeah. He continues to
ruffle.
He has issues with Matthew Ridgway, who's the commander of the 82nd Division. It's the old Brits felt that the Americans liked experience, needed strong advice. And as it turns out, too, there's the allocation of aircraft. We go back to not enough resources. It's being shared with the British Airborne. And Browning interprets as well, if I'm an advisor to Eisenhower, 1st Airborne Division should get first priority. Ridgway's not liking that. And he's thinking, you know what, Eisenhower, you're being unduly influenced by this guy. Browning conducts an inspection of an 82nd Battalion without letting Ridgway know. I mean, that's not good.
No.
Browning, he says, hey, Matt, I need to see your Husky plans. And Ridgway's like, I don't have any. They have to be approved by Pat, and he hasn't approved, so you're not going to look at them. And so this situation goes all the way up the chain to Eisenhower. So that's creating more and more tension. Mm-hmm. And not only is he creating issues with the Americans, there's issues with Hopkinson.
Yeah, good old Hoppy.
Yeah. And what's interesting is they're both the same rank, but Hopkinson is like, I don't need to follow your orders. And he just goes straight to Montgomery. And Hopkinson comes up with the Ladbroke plans, and Monty approves it. Browning sees them, and he's horrified, but he's in no position to reject it because they've already been approved by Montgomery.
Yeah. I mean, Hopkinson dazzles Montgomery, I think, because Montgomery hasn't got a clue about airborne operations at this time. He does a bit of a flim-flam show on Montgomery and gets him to approve these British airborne operations.
Yeah. So who at this stage is the greater zealot, Browning or Hopkinson?
I mean, it's probably harsh to say zealot. I think probably Hopkinson. I know that's easy to say with hindsight, knowing what happened, but yeah, I think Hopkinson was more gung-ho, to use an American term.
Oh, I would agree with that. I just felt it just comes across as Hopkinson was really wanting to prove something.
Well, he'd been in charge of the Air Landing Brigade, hadn't he? Prior to being the divisional commander, he was the brigadier of the 1st Air Landing Brigade. So gliders was his thing, and he was desperate to prove the concept. but it was the wrong operation for gliders. If you'd switched the two operations in Sicily, if you'd switched Fustian and Ladbroke and how they dealt with those operations, so you had the powers going in on Ladbroke and the air landing on Fustian might have been different. I mean, they still would have been scattered all over, but the landing zones would have made a big difference.
Yeah. So we fast forward post-Sicily. 1st Airborne Division is involved, not an airborne operation per se with Italy, but it is there that Hopkinson is killed. And so Browning actually requests, hey, I want to take over 1st Airborne Division. They're like, no, we need you to go to the Far East and you are going to develop airborne forces in India. And that's where he meets up with Mountbatten, who ends up being appointed Supreme Commander, Southeast Asia Command. And it's there that, because of course, Browning had already had a relationship with Mountbatten, and that was with Beatty.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the Bruneval raid.
Yes, the Bruneval raid. So Browning has an advocate in Southeast Asia. So that's going to happen. In 1943, December, he's promoted to acting lieutenant general and commander of the Airborne Corps, which now includes the 1st and 6th Airborne Divisions. And that's when he learns that the 6th Airborne Division will be used in the upcoming cross-channel invasion.
Yeah.
Eric Down is initially chosen to replace Hopkinson, but Down is replaced by none other than Roy Urquhart. And Browning had made attempts to keep Down as 1st Airborne because he was considered a airborne man, but ultimately agreed, okay, doesn't have to be an airborne man as long as this commander was hot from combat experience, hot from battle. And there's no doubt that Roy Urquhart was hot from battle.
Absolutely. I mean, Down had a reputation as being quite a prickly character. So it has been suggested that he was sort of relieved of his command or pushed sideways out to India because he was difficult to work with. But as you say, Browning fought to keep him. And it's interesting that they talk about Browning wanting to take command of 1st Airborne Div in Italy and was refused and sent to India. On reflection, I don't think that would have done him any harm at all to actually take control of guys in combat in a more frontline role. Because the one thing about Browning is, yes, he had a lot of First World War experience on the front line. That had been 20 years previously. Well, and the one thing he is lacking is Second World War frontline experience. And all the guys under him, his brigadiers and colonels, are getting this sort of experience. And I think this right ahead when you get to Arnhem, that's a missed opportunity, I think, there, and it's development.
I think that's a really interesting theory that you put forward there. Had he been able to stay as 1st Airborne Divisional Commander, like you said, 20 years has elapsed since he's seen combat. And I thought this is really interesting because we always hear about the airborne man. He's not viewed as an airborne man, yet he and Down is viewed as the early pioneer. Down had never parachuted. He'd never taken a glider into combat, and his actual combat experience, Urquhart is far more experienced than he is. So here we go. He's the GSO of the 51st Division at the end of the North African campaign. He's commander of the 231 Malta Brigade Group in Sicily. And again, this is where this professional relationship happens versus a personal relationship. He gets back to England. We have access to the 1st Independent Polish Brigade. And that's when we start to see a little bit of the crack in the relationship, professional relationship between Sosabowski and Browning.
Yeah.
He made statements directed at Gavin about Ridgway. Again, file this in the not what to say or how to read a room. Because he was so candid with what he said, it's often viewed as arrogant. And prickly. And it's also quite possible, too, because Ridgway had the problems with Browning, that Ridgway said, hey, you got to watch out for this character. And he described Browning as an empire builder.
Yeah. And I find it hard to not agree with that to a certain extent.
Sure.
I do believe that there was an element of that about Browning.
And again, I'm getting the sense, if you don't know how to take him, if you don't know how to read him, you get an entirely different view. Whereas, again, like what Brian Urquhart had said, is if you could look past some of the facade and look at who the person is, you had a loyal friend for life. And I thought this was really interesting, too, because we just got done talking about Hopkinson feeling like, okay, I don't need to report anything to you. I'm going straight to Montgomery. Well, even though Browning was sidelined for Husky, he never held it against Montgomery. And actually, the two worked very well together. So, you almost wonder too, because I know you have said before, don't confuse personality with ability. And I almost wonder if the relationship between Browning and Montgomery, the reason why it's so successful is because they're very similar character traits, which when viewed from a distance can be viewed as arrogant, prickly, insert foot in mouth.
That does seem to be a British Army officer trait for many a year. And I think it goes back to the upbringing and the class system and all the rest of it.
Sure.
I met some really good officers in my time. And I also met some really bad ones as well.
So he has a June meeting. He's back in Britain, Browning, and the relationship with Sosabowski is getting more and more strained. Sosabowski sees him again, and this is reading Browning. He sees him as stiff and curt. And Browning is like, hey, you should have had your poles ready for activation. You're not ready. Mm-hmm. And Sosabowski is reminding Browning, well, hey, you haven't inspected and looked at, you haven't been around
for months.
Yeah. And there's D-Day. The 6th Airborne Division is involved. 1st Airborne Division is going to sit this one out. And then we see the creation of this 1st Allied Airborne Army. And Browning is going to serve as deputy commander under Lewis H. Brereton.
That's a good place to bring episode 1 to a close. The lead up to Market Garden, that's going to really be a good second episode.
Things were getting away from us, and I just happened to catch a view over there in the Gov.
Not Al Murray.
I'm not going to say yeah, but he's been looking at his watch for a while.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. I certainly have, and I'm sure you have, Kev.
Absolutely. Any chance to just sit down and have a chat is with you, my friend, is a great day.
Yeah, putting the airborne worlds to right. If you have enjoyed this episode, can I just remind our listeners to wherever you listen to us, be it YouTube or Spotify, Podbean, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to us, if you can, leave a comment, a like, or if it's on YouTube, subscribe. If it's not, just give us a follow. We really do value your feedback. So part 2 of this episode is going to be an exclusive for members of our supporters group on buymeacoffee.com. So if you'd like to hear it, then head on over to buymeacoffee.com/hamandjam and sign up. And not only can you get exclusive episodes and bonus content, but supporters can also get access to our regular episodes a week before everyone else. But in the meantime, as Kevin says, the Gov, and we don't mean Mr. Murray, has been giving us the eyeball now. So it's time, gentlemen, please, on another episode of Ham and Jam. So raise a glass. Cheers, Kev.
Cheers.
And Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Hey, I think your pole's ready for activation.